Hello everyone. Welcome to this lecture on culture, negotiation and communication. This lecture is a part of your paper on media, culture and society. In this lecture, we will learn that the struggle for dominance and resistance is a dialectical process. In this dialectical process, ambivalence and negotiations play a significant part. You will come to know that historically, cultural negotiations are inherent part of orthogenetic changes from inside and heterogenetic changes from inside changes. In such processes, at times the counter-cultural processes may not be able to provide an alternative, but at best offers a democratization of the cultural space. You will learn that no culture remains static, but keeps changing while trying to retain its core features. Historically speaking, the culture is endowed with processes of domination and resistance. In the previous module, you studied how dominance is secured by harping on an oppositional classification of classical culture and popular culture. Domination is not achieved by manipulating the world view of the masses. Antonio Gramsci argues that in order to achieve the cultural leadership, the dominant groups have to engage in negotiations with the opposing, or what you can say, subaltern groups, classes and values. Such negotiations result in accommodation. Hence, hegemony is not maintained through the obliteration of the opposite, but through the articulation of opposing interests into the political affiliations of the hegemonic groups. So, culture is a two-way transitive process of interaction and negotiation. It does not exist as a fixed monolithic category to be deconstructed by someone. It is a dialectical process where the contradiction always plays out for establishing or demolishing the hegemony. For such negotiations to take place, ambivalence is a notion which is very important. Because of the components of ambivalence and negotiation, the dichotomy between dominant and dominated is not a fixed but a dynamic aspect. When we use categorizations such as elite and popular culture as dominated and dominant culture, we tend to look at these categories as fixed and monolithic. Culture is a dynamic category and open for negotiations and changes. The dominant culture constitutes the magnetic pole of reference point of the cultural field which may be opposed by other cultures. The other cultures may also seek to disentangle themselves from dominant culture, but they may not evade the element of dominant culture entirely. Thus, ambivalence is the feature of the use of cultural forms in the process of communicational intercourse. So, instead of clear-cut polarization, What exists is a multifarious and far-reaching moves of transactions. This means that historically there are various moments where intense civilizational encounters take place, leading to articulation, negotiation, interweaving and interpretation of cultural forms. Such negotiations and interpretations of cultural forms in the light of industrialization exemplify multilateral transitivity for the editors of the volume Communication, Culture and Confrontation. This means that instead of calling them either modern or traditional, it is a dialectic of modernity and tradition that underscores such ambivalences. Ambivalence is an unavoidable mode of cultural exchange, reappropriation and contention. The idea of ambivalence gives importance to cultural negotiations and interactions rather than relying on exclusive categorizations of classical and popular culture. Both classical and popular culture do not constitute exclusive terrains. They share many elements and speak the same idiom, and this gives the common ground for the conflict. Their clash occurs as a conflict of interpretation. In this backdrop, Guy Poitevin says that the processes of exchange, cooperation, assimilation and reappropriation should be recognized and given as much importance as the processes of autonomous differentiation through counterculture and rejection. Poitevin explains such processes through the examination of popular traditions of grindmill songs in Maharashtra. Let us take that as an example and understand these arguments. For example, in the Sohar songs, one will witness those songs sung by women who negotiate with the tyranny of Sita's life. So, the epitome of womanhood undergoes innovative transformations. Sita in these grindmill songs represents the Sita of peasant women and not of Valmiki's Ramayana. By way of highlighting the tyrannies of Sita's life, grindmill songs or Sohar songs strip both Sita and Ram from their godly characters. They appear as normal human beings who are endowed with values of patriarchal structure. One must not assume that popular traditions always revolt against the dominant culture, but at the same time they are also not the replica of the dominant culture. They at times reflect a mixture of emotions and ambivalence, but this does not necessarily lead to a clear denunciation or resistance. And that is how ambivalence and contradictions are characteristic features of popular cultures. The cultural traditions specific to subordinate groups in cohesive communities emerge not as passive repetitions of dominant models, but through an active process of reinterpretation and selective acceptance. folk traditions should be seen as dynamic elaborations by individuals of their immediate social context and experiences. There can be many ways in which people express their dissatisfaction and opposition to cultural productions perceived as oppressive. It can be reappropriation and reinvestment of internalized dominant patterns with new meanings by subaltern groups within limited margins of freedom of expression and only in dreams, or at the level of discourse and with no impact on the actual historical context of repression. In this sense, from the classical to the popular, the process of interaction leads to borrowing and also rejection from each other. In no society can we find the literati totally isolated from the common man or the classical forms alien to folk forms. Nor can we observe popular traditions keeping themselves completely aloof and unaffected by those forms considered as classical or normative. This shows that no tradition, whether written or oral, whether elitist or popular, remains simply identical over a period of time. No tradition worth the name is static, nor is passed on from one generation to the next, one as a pure repetition. It is in this context that we observe that popular culture is the site where such compromises will take place between hegemonic and subordinate. There are various examples where popular culture's interventionist tendency led to incorporations within the dominant culture. At the same time, when counterculture is appropriated in dominant or as dominant, it is stripped of its characteristics of being counter or resistance. For instance, Bhangra was a local cultural form that was originally associated with a community richest in expatriate or migrant Indians. Then over the years, it was transformed from a local cultural form to being the darling of metropolitan Punjabi popular music. Such examples strengthen the argument put forward by British cultural studies in their critique on the theories of cultural encoding. The import of any particular instance of opposition to the material, political or symbolic basis of dominant communication is more than a mere assertive performance. It signifies that people are not mere consumers of mass culture, but producers of a counterculture. But at the same time, it cannot be argued that the non-dominant is in real sense the alternative, although it can question the hegemony of dominant cultural forms. Another interesting aspect of the assimilations of popular into dominant is that some of the popular or people's cultural forms which have been exorcised and ceased to be a disquieting world, then it is readily integrated into the national heritage with the beauty of a dead. Cultural assimilation takes place in the reassuring museum. You have a classic example of such museumization of popular culture. You must have seen how tribal folk songs and dances have become essential part of official celebrations. Tribal dance forms a spectacle for such events. Ironically, the folk dance and songs which represent many a times the critique of dominant cultural forms are expressed as items for entertainment. Stuart Hall sums up both the process of incorporations of dominant into popular and vice versa in these words. Popular forms become enhanced in cultural value, go up the cultural escalator and find themselves on the opposite side. Others, things, cease to have high cultural value and are appropriated into the popular, becoming transformed in the process. Further, it should be noted that the specific cultural traditions belonging to subordinate groups are not mere passive repetitions of the cultural models belonging to dominant groups. There is an active process of reinterpretation and selective acceptance involved here. We've discussed cultural negotiations in this module. We've discussed two processes of negotiations. First, in which some elements of the dominant are appropriated by the subordinate, and the second where the subordinate cultural values are incorporated and appropriated into dominant. Grindmill songs are discussed to exemplify the process of ambivalence and negotiations. For more details, please read the modules carefully and attempt the questions given in the end of each module. Thank you.